So welcome back onto this lesson 2 of Oracle HTTP server module. And in this, we are looking at deployment topology of 12c. But before that, let me do a quick recap on what we have covered in the previous lesson. We looked at, or we briefly covered, what is Oracle HTTP server. We mentioned that it's a web server. The main two components are listeners and modules. And we also looked at there are three listeners. One is for administration port. Second, other two listeners are for end users, HTTP and HTTPS. These port numbers, you can change them during install and configure or later as well. Now, this is the deployment topology or a typical deployment. I said when we were discussing the Oracle Fusion Middleware high-level architecture or Oracle's enterprise reference architecture, the Oracle HTTP server always sits on the most probably DMZ. You can put it in an application tier as well, but demilitarized zone between the end users and to the application tier or the middle tier. And there are default modules called WebGate module as well as other modules like ModWL, OHS, and so on. Um, Load balancers typically will make a call, or client can directly come to the Oracle HTTP server, or client via the load balancer can come to the HTTP server, and HTTP server will then in turn forward request to the WebLogic server. So this is a 12c deployment model. So what you have, there are two modes we call in 12c. One is called as standalone domain, and second is co-located domain. So standalone domain and co-located domain. I said to you when we were looking in Fusion middleware that with Oracle HTTP server, WebLogic is now mandatory. So there is no OPM in 12c. So in 11g, if you're coming from 11g background, you know that 11g version of Oracle WebLogic server, 11g version of Oracle HTTP server used to be managed by OPMN, but not anymore in 12c. So what you do in 12c? In 12c, this is managed by WebLogic Node Manager. However, you don't need to create a full WebLogic domain. And if you have not clear yet what is a WebLogic domain, there should be a dedicated module about WebLogic domain, Node Manager, and all those concepts should be already be there in the previous module. So what is going to happen? This is that one deployment where you configure Oracle HTTP server, but in standalone WebLogic domain, which means there's no admin server, there's no managed server, there's just a node manager. Then other option is where you have a co-located domain. In co-located domain, you create a WebLogic domain. This WebLogic domain will have an admin server and will have just one system component, which is Oracle HTTP server. In the previous one, which is single domain or standalone domain, in that domain, all you had was one system component, which is Oracle HTTP server and a node manager. Here in co-located mode, you have an administration server and you also have a system component called Oracle HTTP server. Why you need, or in what scenarios you will pick up a co-located domain, and in what scenario you will pick up standalone domain, I'm going to cover that in a minute. But assume right now you have two options. The important thing to note here is in that 12c version of Oracle HTTP server, node manager is mandatory. Before you can start HTTP server, node manager must be up and running in 12c. So node manager plays a bigger role in 12c now. Whereas in 11g, there was no concept of 11g node manager in Oracle HTTP server. So this is another deployment model, but this time for high availability in co-located domain. So you have two servers, and in two servers, this is a machine 1 and machine 2. You have on HTTP server one system component and a WebLogic admin server. You want high availability in co-located domain model. This is how you do. So you have two servers, server machine 1 and machine 2. You have one system component in the domain, which is Oracle HTTP server 1. You have second system component, which is Oracle HTTP server 2. Both will have their own node managers because they are sitting on a different machines. Then there'll be an admin server which will be basically managing these two, which means it's a co-located domain model. And if you want to start services and stop services, this node manager will be required. So whether you're starting and stopping services from a command line or from a console, in second model, which is co-located domain, in either cases the node manager will be mandatory. The node manager is the one which is going and issuing startup command to Oracle HTTP server. So it's big change in 12c. I'll if you're not clear, go and listen this training one more time, or maybe when we go a little bit deep, you will understand this topology in a minute. So let me quickly cover what is standalone versus co-located topology. As I said, when you deploy, you can either deploy in a standalone domain, which means a WebLogic domain with no administration server, no managed server. Now, if you go back and if you've heard me last in 11G, I said a WebLogic domain must always have a admin server. In 12c, you can have a WebLogic domain without any admin server, without any managed server, and just system component, because system component now in 12c are moved to WebLogic now, or in a domain. So you have a standalone domain with no admin server, no managed server, just system component, which is Oracle HTTP server. Or you can have it in a co-located domain, which means an admin server with Oracle system component. And then within co-located domain, you can have a full JRF or restricted JRF. I'm going to cover that as well in a minute. What does full JRF or restricted JRF means? In what scenario you will use full JRF? In what scenario you will use restricted JRF? In what scenario you will use co-located domain? In what scenario you will use standalone domain? So standalone domain is use this topology if you don't want Oracle HTTP server to be managed by Fusion Middleware Control. So this is the topology going to look like that you see in the right hand side bottom, that you have Oracle HTTP server and you are controlling, or you want just HTTP server, nothing else. Node manager will still be mandatory. You will be configuring, when you configure standalone, that time you will be the standalone domain is if you don't want your Oracle HTTP server to be managed by Fusion Middleware Control, which means there's no WebLogic admin server, there's no application called FMW control. So what you're going to do, this topology is mainly used when you're deploying Oracle HTTP server in the DMZ, which is quite common. So most of the time you will be deploying it in standalone mode. Sometimes you might use HTTP server for internal network traffic. And in that case, you can, or you want your HTTP server to be managed via the graphical user interface, which is Fusion Middleware Control. So you can still manage your standalone domain, but you will be using WebLogic scripting tool, not the enterprise manager. So what you do when you configure the Oracle HTTP server, you say, I want a standalone domain. It will give you an option. You say, I want a standalone domain, and then you create HTTP server with, or a WebLogic domain with just one system component. How we create, we are going to see that when we cover installation. So you will be creating domain or WebLogic domain with just one system component, no admin server, no managed server. So that's called as standalone domain. Then you have co-located domain, and co-located domain is again comes into two flavors. You can do a full JRF mode, or you can have a restricted JRF mode. So in full JRF, I'm going to cover that what is mean by full JRF mode and a restricted JRF mode as well in a minute. So when you configure Oracle HTTP server, you can say, hey, I want to configure HTTP server in a co-located domain model, and within co-located domain model, I want full JRF, or I want restricted JRF. So full JRF is basically you deploy, in both the cases, you get a domain with an admin server as well as a system component, which is Oracle HTTP server. So what you're going to do, you're going to get a WebLogic domain with one admin server, one OHS system component. Now, full JRF requires a database to store some configurations. So in that mode, when you're doing a full JRF mode, you are going to do Oracle database as well. So before installing or before configuring HTTP server, you need to install a software called Oracle Fusion Middleware Infrastructure. That Oracle Fusion Middleware Infrastructure will give all the necessary infrastructure like WebLogic, like a WebLogic server, as well as a enterprise manager application on top of that, so that you can manage this Oracle HTTP server using enterprise manager. However, in a restricted JRF mode, it doesn't need a database. You will still be deploying enterprise manager, but you will not be configuring a database. All the configurations will be stored in a file-based repository in that mode. So for example, if you need a key store by default will go into the database if you have a full JRF domain. However, if you're in a restricted JRF domain model, you're going to put that in those configurations will go into the file system. There's no cross-domain or cross-component wiring possible between OHS and WebLogic Enterprise Manager or WebLogic Server or other components in Fusion Middleware via the Enterprise Manager. So if you have configured your Oracle HTTP server in a restricted JRF mode, some of the Enterprise Manager options may not be available through, or some of these integrations will not be possible through the GUI, or those options may have been disabled. You can still configure, you can still integrate, but then you will have to use the command line utility like Node Manager. So use this if you're planning this domain or WebLogic domain that you're configuring. If you're planning it just for Oracle HTTP server and OTD, then use a standalone or a co-located domain in JRF mode. If you're planning to use that WebLogic domain for other things as well, like SOA or OBIE or Web Center, then use full JRF mode. So let me repeat one more time because it could be quite confusing first time if you're doing it. So first of all, you can deploy Oracle HTTP server either in a standalone domain mode or a co-located domain mode. When will you pick standalone domain? If you don't want your HTTP server to be managed by Oracle Fusion Middleware Control. When will you pick co-located? When you want your HTTP server to be managed and controlled and configured via the Fusion Middleware Control. Within co-located domain, you can pick up either a full JRF mode or restricted mode. You will use that full JRF mode if in that WebLogic domain you have other Fusion Middleware products like SOA, OBI, Web Center. If all you are doing in that WebLogic domain is OTD, Oracle Traffic Director and Oracle HTTP server, then you can use it with restricted JRF. Because in full JRF, there is a dependency of Oracle database. And what does JRF means here? JRF means Java required files. These are the required files which are used to run some Fusion Middleware applications, to connect to the database and few other things or additional things. So Java required files. So those are, so you still have, and for enterprise manager, so you will still be you'll be using Java required files, but in a restrictive mode. That means there's no connection to the database required in restricted JRF mode. So pick up when you're deploying, what you're going to do is in co-located mode, you're creating a domain with an admin server and a system component. In standalone mode, there is no admin server, there'll be a domain, but only for HTTP server. So this is all about co-located and deployment model. So let me repeat one more time, that when you configure Oracle HTTP server 12c, and this is only applicable for 12c. If it's 11g, there's no such concept. There is a OPM manage, which we'll cover in coming modules. So what you have, you can deploy it in standalone or co-located. Within co-located, you can do it either in JRF, full JRF or restricted JRF. And how to do, this is the diagram look like in standalone domain. You have a node manager managing the HTTP server. There's no admin server. Whereas in co-located domain, you have an admin server with Oracle HTTP server. So this is all about the deployment or co-located and standalone domain deployment model. We are going to look next is installation, and things will become much more clear when you install or when you look at the installation screens, or these are the installation steps which we are going to look in next lesson. So the flow chart or the steps, you can either install it on standalone mode or co-located domain model. We'll see that in next lesson. I'll see you in next lesson of installation of Oracle HTTP Server 12c.